A television studio in Burbank, California, April 1969. Johnny Cash is sitting across a table from Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, who's just handed him a handwritten list. 6 songs Nixon wants Cash to perform on his upcoming White House performance. Welfare Cadillac, Okie from Muskogee, songs that mock protesters and welfare recipients, songs that align Johnny Cash with Nixon's silent majority campaign. Nixon is smiling, friendly, but there's weight behind it. The President of the United States doesn't make requests, he makes offers you can't refuse. And Johnny Cash has about 90 seconds to decide whether he's willing to become a political prop. What he says next will define his relationship with power for the rest of his career. If stories about moments when political pressure met artistic independence, when refusing the president carried real consequences matter to you, consider subscribing. This is what we examine here. April 1969. Johnny Cash was at the peak of his comeback. The Folsom Prison album had been a massive success. His ABC variety show was pulling huge ratings. He was selling out concerts. He'd become more than a country music star. He'd become a cultural figure, which made him valuable to politicians. Richard Nixon had been inaugurated 3 months earlier. His administration was dealing with massive anti-war protests, urban unrest, and a cultural divide that was tearing the country apart. Nixon's strategy was to position himself as the voice of the silent majority, working-class Americans who supported traditional values and opposed the counterculture. And he wanted Johnny Cash as a symbol of that majority. Cash had been invited to perform at the White House, a formal state dinner. It was an honor, a recognition, the kind of validation most performers never received. But there was a catch. The invitation came with expectations, with suggestions, with a handwritten list from the president himself of songs he hoped Johnny would perform. The meeting happened at a television studio in Burbank, where Cash was taping his variety show. Nixon was in California for political events. Someone on his staff arranged a brief meeting, 15 minutes, casual, just the president stopping by to personally extend the invitation and discuss the performance. It was anything but casual. Johnny Cash was in his dressing room when Secret Service agents arrived, told him the president wanted to speak with him, gave him 5 minutes to prepare. June Carter was there, told him to be careful, told him that politicians didn't make social calls, that Nixon wanted something. Johnny walked into the conference room. Nixon was already there, standing, smiling, hand extended. "Johnny, so good to see you. Thanks for making time." They shook hands. Nixon's grip was firm, calculated. "Mr. President, please sit. I know you're busy. I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to personally extend this invitation and talk about what we're planning." They sat across from each other, a small table between them. Nixon's chief of staff stood near the door, watching, taking mental notes. Nixon pulled out a folded piece of paper, set it on the table between them. "I've been a fan of your music for years, Johnny. Vivian and I both have. And when we were planning this White House event, your name was at the top of our list. You represent something important, Johnny, something authentic, something that speaks to real Americans." Johnny nodded slowly, said nothing. Nixon continued, "I took the liberty of putting together some song suggestions, nothing mandatory, of course, but these are songs I think would resonate with the audience, with the moment we're in as a country." He slid the paper across the table. Johnny looked at it. 6 song titles written in Nixon's handwriting. Welfare Cadillac, Okie from Muskogee, A Boy Named Sue, Folsom Prison Blues, The Fightin' Side of Me, I Walk the Line. Think about what that list represents. Some of those songs were Johnny's, but others, Welfare Cadillac, Okie from Muskogee, The Fightin' Side of Me, those were explicitly political, anti-protest, anti-welfare. Songs that would align Johnny Cash with Nixon's political agenda. What would you do with that list? Leave a comment. I want to know. Johnny studied the list, took his time. Nixon waited, patient, confident. Mr. President, some of these aren't my songs. I'm aware, but they're songs that represent the values we're celebrating. Merle Haggard wrote Okie, I know. Guy Drake wrote Welfare Cadillac. But they're songs that speak to hard-working Americans, people who follow the rules, who believe in this country. Your audience. They might be Merle's audience, I'm not sure they're mine. Nixon's smile didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Johnny, let me be direct. You've built your career on being the voice of working people, of prisoners, of folks who've been left behind by the system. That's admirable. That's why we want you at the White House. He paused. But right now, this country is being torn apart by people who don't respect that, by protesters who burn flags, by welfare recipients who abuse the system, by people who've turned their backs on everything that made this country great. We need voices, respected voices, to stand up for the people who still believe. And you want me to be one of those voices. I want you to represent the people who already see themselves in you, the silent majority. They love your music because you understand them, because you've lived what they've lived. All I'm asking is that you perform songs that honor that connection. Johnny set the paper down. Mr. President, with respect, Welfare Cadillac is a song that mocks poor people. It suggests that welfare recipients are lazy, gaming the system, living high while honest people struggle. It's a song about accountability, about work ethic, about not enabling dependence. It's a song of contempt for people who are poor, and I grew up poor. My family picked cotton. We lived in government housing. We were the people that song is mocking. Nixon's expression hardened slightly. Then you understand the difference between people who work their way out of poverty and people who expect handouts. Your family worked. That's the point. That's what we're celebrating. Johnny leaned back. This was the moment, the decision point. Mr. President, I appreciate the invitation. I'm honored to perform at the White House, but I need to be clear about something. I don't perform songs I don't believe in. I don't use my platform to push messages that contradict who I am. I'm not asking you to contradict who you are. I'm asking you to acknowledge your audience, the people who made you successful. Don't you owe them that? I owe them honesty, not agreement with everything they believe. Nixon stood, walked to the window. The power dynamic shifted. This wasn't a friendly conversation anymore. This was negotiation. Johnny, let me tell you how this works. You've been given an extraordinary opportunity to perform for the president at the White House. That kind of exposure, that kind of endorsement, it matters. It elevates you. It tells the entire country that you're someone important, someone worth listening to. He turned back. But that opportunity comes with expectations, with responsibilities. You can't accept the honor and then refuse to deliver what's expected. That's not how any of this works. So the invitation is conditional on me performing the songs you want. The invitation is an expression of respect. I'm hoping you'll reciprocate that respect by considering what's being asked of you. Johnny stood too. Now they were both on their feet. Mr. President, I've been arrested 7 times. I've been addicted to pills. I've been in cells with men the system threw away. I've performed in prisons where guys are serving life for crimes they committed when they were desperate or broken. And you want me to perform songs that mock people for being poor, that celebrate law enforcement without questioning whether the laws are just? Nixon's voice was cold now. I want you to remember who pays for those prison concerts, who allows them to happen. The system you're so quick to criticize is the same system that gave you a platform, that made your career possible. The system didn't make my career possible. People did. People who saw themselves in the stories I told. And those people aren't a political monolith. They're not all on your side or anyone's side. They're just trying to survive. Nixon walked back to the table. His chief of staff shifted position slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. Johnny, I'm going to be very clear with you. This invitation can be extended or withdrawn. The decision is mine. If you're not interested in performing songs that align with the values of this administration, I can find other performers who are. Then you should do that. Nixon seemed genuinely surprised. You're refusing to perform at the White House? I'm refusing to be a political prop. If you want me to perform my songs, the songs I've written, the songs that represent what I actually believe, I'm honored to do that, but I'm not performing Merle Haggard songs to score political points for your silent majority campaign. You realize what you're turning down: the prestige, the exposure, the validation of being chosen by the president. I realize I'm turning down the chance to lie about who I am for political convenience. Yeah, I understand that. Nixon's face was rigid now. The friendly pretense was gone. Let me tell you what else you're turning down. You're turning down the goodwill of this administration, the access, the support. You think your prison concerts happen without government approval? You think your platform isn't affected by whether the White House sees you as friend or enemy? Johnny's voice was steady. If my platform depends on lying, I don't want it. It's not lying, it's strategy. It's understanding how power works. You perform these songs, you solidify your base, you show working Americans that you're on their side, and in return, you get protection, support, access to audiences you couldn't reach otherwise. Or I perform my own songs, I tell my own stories, and I don't owe anyone anything. Nixon stared at him for a long moment, then he picked up the list, folded it carefully, put it back in his pocket. You're making a mistake, Johnny. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Do you know how many artists would kill for this opportunity? How many people would love to be standing where you're standing right now? Then invite one of them. Invite Merle. He wrote those songs. Let him perform them. He'll probably do a better job anyway. Nixon walked to the door, stopped, turned back. I admired you. I thought you understood what was at stake in this country. I thought you cared about the people who believe in law and order, who work hard, who play by the rules. Turns out you're just another entertainer with delusions about being an artist. Johnny didn't flinch. And turns out you're just another politician who thinks everyone has a price. Nixon's chief of staff moved forward. Mr. President, We're done here. Nixon looked at Johnny one more time. The invitation is withdrawn. You won't be performing at the White House. Consider this conversation confidential. If I hear about it in the press, there will be consequences. What kind of consequences? Nixon smiled, cold. The kind you don't see coming until they've already destroyed you. He left. The chief of staff followed. The door closed. Johnny stood alone in the conference room for several minutes, not moving, processing what had just happened. If this moment, this refusal to compromise artistic integrity for political access means something to you, hit the like button. It helps these stories reach more people. That's all. Just, if it mattered, let it show. Johnny Cash did eventually perform at the White House, but not for Richard Nixon. The invitation was quietly reissued weeks later through different channels. Nixon's staff wanted to avoid the political embarrassment of having a major cultural figure publicly refuse a White House invitation. The compromise was this: Johnny would perform, but he'd choose his own set list, No political songs, no silent majority messaging, just his music. Nixon agreed, publicly, but privately he never forgave the rejection. Over the next few years, several of Johnny Cash's prison concert proposals were denied without explanation. Government agencies that had previously been supportive became bureaucratic obstacles. Permits were delayed. Security concerns were raised. Nothing overt, nothing provable, just the subtle machinery of political retribution making things harder than they needed to be. Johnny never spoke publicly about the confrontation with Nixon, honored the president's request for confidentiality, but he also never performed Welfare Cadillac or The Fight Inside of Me, never let himself be used as a political symbol for any administration. Years later, after Nixon resigned in disgrace following Watergate, someone asked Johnny about his relationship with the Nixon White House. He was careful in his response, diplomatic, said he'd been honored to perform, said he respected the office even when he disagreed with the person holding it. But then he added something that revealed the truth of what had happened in that conference room. "I've never believed that my music belongs to a political movement. It belongs to people, all kinds of people, and the minute I start performing songs because a politician thinks it'll help his agenda, I've stopped being an artist and started being a salesman." The interviewer pushed, asked if he'd ever been pressured to align himself politically. Everyone gets pressured. That's how power works. Power wants to claim you, to use your voice as validation. And the test isn't whether you get pressured, it's whether you say no. And you said no? When it mattered? Yeah, I said no. What Johnny Cash couldn't say publicly was how much that refusal cost him. Not just the political retribution, the blocked permits, the denied proposals, the subtle obstacles, but the personal cost, the knowledge that he could have had more access, more support, more institutional backing if he'd just performed the songs Nixon wanted, if he'd just played along. There were nights he questioned it, wondered if he'd been stubborn for the sake of being stubborn, whether artistic integrity was worth the practical consequences. But then he'd remember what Nixon had asked him to do, perform songs that mocked the poor, that celebrated enforcement without questioning justice, that turned working people into a political monolith rather than acknowledging their complexity. And he'd remember that saying yes to that, even once, would have changed something fundamental about who he was, would have confirmed that his principles were negotiable, that his platform was available to the highest bidder. The strange thing about that confrontation with Nixon is that both men thought they'd lost. Nixon thought he'd lost the opportunity to claim Johnny Cash as a political asset, to use his cultural credibility to validate the silent majority campaign. Johnny thought he'd lost access, protection, the institutional support that came with presidential favor. But the real victory, the one neither of them recognized in that moment, was that Johnny Cash had established a boundary, had proven to himself that his art wasn't for sale, that no amount of prestige or access or political power could make him perform songs he didn't believe in. That boundary protected him for the rest of his career. Every time a politician or corporation or industry executive tried to use him, he had that moment to point back to, the time he'd said no to the President of the United States. If he could refuse Nixon, he could refuse anyone. Richard Nixon wanted Johnny Cash to perform Welfare Cadillac because he understood something true. Cultural figures have political power. Their choices send messages. Their platforms validate or challenge prevailing narratives. What Nixon didn't understand was that Johnny Cash's power came from his authenticity, from people believing he meant what he said, that he stood for something real. The moment Cash started performing songs for political convenience, that authenticity would have died, and with it, the very thing that made him valuable in the first place. Nixon saw Johnny Cash as an asset to be deployed. Johnny saw himself as an artist whose credibility depended on not being deployed. Both men were operating from legitimate worldviews. Nixon understood how power actually works, through symbols, alliances, strategic messaging. Johnny understood how art works, through honesty, independence, refusing to be claimed. And in that conference room in Burbank, those two worldviews collided. This wasn't just about Johnny Cash refusing to perform certain songs. It was about what happens when political power tries to claim artistic voices, when access and prestige come with expectations, when the price of institutional support is ideological alignment. Richard Nixon offered Johnny Cash validation from the highest office in the land, recognition, prestige, protection. All Johnny had to do was perform 6 songs, 90 minutes of music that aligned with Nixon's political messaging. Johnny Cash walked away, not because he was brave, not because he was noble, but because the cost of saying yes was higher than the cost of saying no. Saying yes meant confirming that his platform was available, that his voice could be rented, that his principles were negotiable under the right circumstances. Saying no meant losing access, facing retribution, making things harder than they needed to be. But it also meant remaining himself, maintaining the authenticity that made people listen to him in the first place, proving that some things, artistic integrity, personal honesty, the right to tell your own story, aren't for sale. Not even to the President of the United States. If stories like this matter to you, stories about refusing power when it comes with strings, about choosing independence over access, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the like button. These are the moments that don't make official histories. The private confrontations where someone said no to the most powerful person in the room, where integrity cost something real. This is history, told from inside the rooms where power and art negotiate. And if that matters to you, I'm glad you're here.